All right, so are you ready for this? We are diving deep today into one of the most talked about and I'd say debated cases of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
And it all revolves around a young boy.
Yes.
Known as Roland Doe.
Roland Doe.
Now, what's interesting is this case is the real-life inspiration
Wow.
for the iconic horror film, The Exorcist.
Oh, The Exorcist.
So even if you're someone who hasn't seen the movie, chances are
Right.
you've at least heard whispers or stories
Absolutely.
about this infamous case.
Yes.
We've got a ton of research and different sources here. We're going to really break down not just the events themselves, but all the different explanations that have come out over the years surrounding this case.
It's a story that really, gets to people, right? It captures the imagination because, who isn't kind of at least a little bit afraid of the things that we can't explain?
Right.
And it touches on our deepest fears and questions about, what is reality?
Yeah. Makes you question everything.
What's even more interesting is that it's not just like a ghost story, right? It's grounded in a very specific time and place, the suburbs of D.C. in the late 1940s.
Okay, so for someone who isn't familiar with this story, set the scene for us.
Okay.
Who was Roland Doe?
Okay.
And what were some of the first events that set this whole thing off?
So Roland Doe was a pseudonym, right? They used that to protect his identity.
Right.
But we know he was about 13 at the time.
Okay.
And the unsettling events, they started not too long after the death of his Aunt Harriet.
Okay.
And this is where it gets interesting, right? Aunt Harriet was what they call a spiritualist, someone who believed you could talk to spirits.
Okay.
And she was the one who introduced Roland to the Ouija board.
The Ouija board?
The Ouija board.
I mean, that just sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It does.
Just add water and stir,
Right.
But was it really a factor? Or is it just kind of like a spooky coincidence that it's part of the story?
It's really hard to say, but I think many people believe that Ouija board was like an invitation.
Oh, what?
Or it acted as a catalyst
Right.
for all the disturbances that came later.
Okay.
We got to remember that, back in the 40s, spiritualism was actually pretty popular.
Okay.
And this idea that you could talk to spirits wasn't totally out there.
Oh, okay.
So
Interesting.
after Aunt Harriet dies, things start happening around Roland.
Okay, like what?
Like scratching sounds, things moving by themselves, furniture sliding across the room.
Like poltergeist activity?
Exactly, poltergeist activity.
For those of us who aren't super familiar with paranormal terms, what does that even mean?
So a poltergeist is basically like a noisy spirit,
Okay.
a mischievous spirit, and it causes physical disturbances.
Okay.
And poltergeist activity is the name for all those unexplained things, right? Stuff moving, noises, physical phenomena. And it's usually tied to these spirits.
Oh, shit.
So for Roland, these disturbances, they were scary, but it was going to get a lot worse.
Okay, so it goes from weird noises to what? Full-on possession.
Not quite yet, but the disturbances definitely became more intense, more frequent, and way more frightening.
Give us some details.
Yeah, so we have stories of Roland going into, trances, speaking in these deep guttural voices that didn't sound like him at all, and then violent outbursts that were so out of character for him.
I've also heard about that crazy part of the story where, words start showing up on his skin.
Yes.
I mean, how do you explain that?
Right, so witnesses said they saw scratches.
Okay.
And words like hell and Christ just appearing on Roland's skin, out of nowhere.
That's nuts.
It's one of the most chilling and hardest to explain parts of this whole case.
So at this point, his family's got to be freaking out.
They were terrified.
What did they do?
So they went to their pastor, a Lutheran pastor named Luther Schultz, to ask for help.
Okay.
Pastor Schultz, he tried to help, but after a while, he was like, this is bigger than me.
Yeah.
And get this, he actually suggested that the family seek out a Catholic exorcism.
So they went from a Lutheran pastor to a Catholic exorcism.
Yeah, it was a big jump.
Why?
Well, it seems like Pastor Schultz, he really believed that whatever was happening was demonic.
Oh, okay.
And he thought that a Catholic priest,
Okay.
someone who was experienced in exorcisms,
Right.
would be the best person to handle it.
Okay.
So he introduced the family to Father Raymond J. Bishop and Father William S. Bowdern, two Jesuit priests who were known for their work with exorcisms.
Okay, so what went down at these exorcisms?
So the exorcisms went on for several weeks, and the people who were there, they described the whole thing as truly terrifying.
Right.
They said Roland had superhuman strength during these exorcisms, that he spoke languages he didn't know, and that he reacted violently to anything religious. Like what? Crosses, Bibles, holy water, that sort of thing.
It's kind of like a horror movie, you know?
It is, right.
Just picturing it.
You've got these priests, they're reciting prayers, they're giving commands, Roland's fighting them, and the whole atmosphere is just thick with fear and this feeling that something unknown is at play.
So even back then, were people questioning whether it was actually a demonic possession?
Oh, absolutely. Even while these exorcisms were happening.
Right.
There were skeptics who offered alternative explanations for Roland's behavior.
Like what?
Well, some suggested that maybe he had a psychological disorder that was causing him to act this way.
Interesting.
You know, his behavior was so extreme, it was so out of the ordinary, that some people thought maybe there was a medical or psychological reason for it.
Are there any, like, specific psychological conditions that could explain what was going on?
Yeah, so some experts have pointed to things like dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, as a possible explanation for the personality changes and the way his behavior shifted so dramatically.
Okay, interesting.
Others have said maybe it was a form of psychosis, which is a mental state where someone loses touch with reality.
So they were looking at mental health as a possibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were there any investigations back then, like from a skeptical standpoint?
Yeah, some people investigated it looking for signs of trickery or just, natural explanations for what was happening. Some of them, they concluded that the physical stuff, like the scratches, might have been self-inflicted.
Well,
Maybe even subconsciously, like he wasn't even aware he was doing it.
so even with all those people who said they saw what happened, there's still room for doubt.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this case so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like a puzzle with missing pieces, and we're all left to weigh the evidence and decide what we believe.
And in this case, with all of its mystery, it inspired one of the most famous horror books and movies ever.
I know, it's crazy. The author of The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty, he was a student at Georgetown at the time, and he heard about Roland Doe's case, and it just stuck with him. It made such an impression on him that he used it as the basis for his book. And then, of course, that book was turned into the movie in 1973.
And then, The Exorcist, the movie, became like this cultural phenomenon.
Huge.
It's crazy how this one case, even today, continues to freak people out.
I know, right? It's wild.
Why do you think this story is still so powerful? Why does it capture our imaginations, even after all these years?
I think, deep down, we're all a little bit afraid of the unknown, right? The idea that there might be forces out there that we can't understand, that we can't control.
It's scary.
And they could mess with our lives.
Yeah.
And it also makes us question what we believe in, right? And the power of suggestion.
Whether you believe in demons or you think there's some psychological reason for it all, the Roland Doe case, it really forces us to think about the limits of what we know.
It does.
And all the mysteries that are still out there in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes you wonder what else is out there.
It really does.
What else we haven't discovered?
Absolutely.
What else we can't explain?
Yeah. I mean, think about all the stories, right? All the legends and myths that exist in different cultures.
Right.
There's always this fascination with the things we can't quite grasp.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, where do those stories come from?
Exactly.
Is there any truth to them?
Right. Is there something more going on?
Food for thought.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.
That's it for this week's Deep Dive.
Until next time.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.